Welcome, everyone. And thank you for our alumni and students and parents and friends, staff and future students, and any guests. How many of you are family members? Like family? Okay. All right. I was sitting ahead of you, so I knew that you were here. Anyway, we want to welcome all of you here to the annual Mandel Leadership Fellows Capstone presentation. I'm Sharon Milligan, the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Student Services here at the Mandel School. And I'm standing on behalf of our Dean, Dexter Voussan, who sends you his regards and appreciation for your being here with us tonight to learn from and support our 2025 Mandel Leadership Fellows. And Leadership Fellows, could you raise your hand? Everybody, great, you're on, yes, they're on the front row here, ready to go. So on another note, I'd like to share that we are at the cusp of a tremendous milestone of any university, and certainly this university. CSWRU was established in 1826, and in 2026, we will celebrate our bicentennial. Now, there are going to be a lot of events, exciting events, that we want to share with you as we move along, and we have a lot planned, and we hope that you will join us as we celebrate this university's bicentennial. The festivities will culminate in fall of 2026 with a monumental CWRU bicentennial celebration. It should be a lot of fun. So that's your first invitation, if you just heard about our bicentennial tonight. As I turn the program over to Associate Professor David Hussey, who is the Mandel Leadership Fellows Program Director, I want to extend my thanks to Dr. Hussey for his leadership of this really invaluable program that has been instituted since 2012 at the Mandel School due to the generous support of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. So thank you again for being here with us tonight and supporting our outstanding 2025 Mandel Fellows. And I look forward to conversing with you and convening as we look at the posters after their presentations. I'd love to hear what you have to say and what questions you ask them, and to watch them shine for us and shine for Case Western Reserve University. It's Mandel School. Dr. Hussey?
Thank you, Dean Milligan, for that warm welcome. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to all the members and friends who are here, to our new and our former fellows visiting us, our mentors, and our students who are able to join us this evening. The capstone presentations are the culminating learning experience of the Mandel Leadership Fellows Program. Using an evidence-based lens, the fellows examine compelling practice issues, and they typically propose innovations or advancements. As you listen carefully tonight, you'll learn about integrated care, full-service schools, new and exciting possibilities in participatory grant-making and citizens' assemblies, the role of AI in social work, and you'll be introduced to the lizard brain. Our fellows are representative of all of our students, and these 6 capstone projects magnificently illustrate the depth and breadth of social work practice and the early grasp that our students have on both practice challenges and practice solutions to some of the most complex issues that we face. The capstone projects are completed over one semester and are often conducted in concert with the fellows' mentors, with faculty, and with supervisors at their field placements. There are two components to the capstone session this evening. The first will be brief 7-minute presentations, approximately, by each of our fellows that are live streamed, and then we'll transition to the traditional poster session where you do get a chance to ask questions and really discuss with the fellows the research, the findings that they have in their posters. In the chat, you'll see contact information for the fellows. Feel free to send them questions or comments. I'm sure that they'll get back to you, not this evening, but perhaps tomorrow or the day after. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Ms. Cristina Chavez.
We got a little off track here. Good evening, everybody. I'm very happy, although a little bit nervous, to be with you tonight. Happy to see some familiar faces. My name is Cristina Chavez, and tonight I'm here to talk with you about the Comprehensive Health Integration Framework and Advancing Integrated Healthcare and Outcomes. So in recent years, the integration of physical and behavioral health has become a priority in both healthcare delivery and policy. Many organizations are seeking cost-effective solutions to improve health outcomes while enhancing patient experience. The Comprehensive Health Integration Framework, or the CHI framework, is a promising intervention to help organizations with strengthening service integration and improving outcomes while addressing the social determinants of health for individuals with co-occurring physical and behavioral health conditions. So what is integrated healthcare? Well, in comparison to standard care, where physical, mental health, and substance use disorders are typically treated separately, and there's little, if any, coordination among providers, integrated healthcare refers to primary and behavioral healthcare clinicians working together to provide patient-centered, coordinated care to address all of an individual's healthcare needs. Why is this important? For individuals with co-occurring physical and behavioral health and social determinant of health needs, they tend to experience worse health outcomes along with higher healthcare costs. If we take this one step further, looking at individuals with serious mental illness, they experience high rates of comorbidities, including substance use disorders and chronic health conditions like cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. These diseases can be prevented and treated through intervention and screening, which the CHI framework seeks to address. This also contributes to health disparities and reductions in life expectancy by up to 25 years. The evidence suggests that integrated services can increase access to care, improve outcomes, and reduce service fragmentation and healthcare costs. This makes sense at a very basic level. It simplifies things for providers and patients by improving communication and reducing barriers. Patients can address all of their healthcare needs in one setting where they feel most comfortable and engaged with their providers. It also aligns with recent healthcare trends like the SAMHSA strategic plan, which has prioritized integrating physical and behavioral health. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid also recently announced their innovation in behavioral health model, which will be piloted across several states this year. Many certified community behavioral health clinics and federally qualified health centers are also moving in the direction of integrated healthcare. So a little bit about my methods and background for this project. I started with a literature review about integrated healthcare just to get an overview of the different types of models. I identified various models existing along a continuum ranging from coordinated, co-located, to fully integrated care, which can be seen very tiny below in the abstract section. One of the key findings was that despite the potential benefits of these models, they're widely underutilized due to implementation challenges. This led to the question of how can organizations effectively implement integrated healthcare? On further review of the literature, I identified two key frameworks, one of them being the SAMHSA 6 levels of collaboration and integration, and the second one being the Comprehensive Health Integration Framework, which I'm speaking about tonight, and that one also builds on the first one that I mentioned. So what is the CHI framework? It is an organizational implementation, self-assessment, and quality improvement tool to support bi-directional physical and behavioral health integration in the setting where the patient is most naturally engaged. It provides 8 domains of integration, progressing across 3 stages, again, which you can see below the methods section there. It has an additional emphasis on the social determinants of health and health equity for underserved populations, while providing clear, measurable, and evidence-based standards to guide and sustain integrated service delivery. It also provides recommendations for providers, payers, and policymakers on system practice and payment design, along with measuring process to show the impact. It also provides it's adaptable across diverse populations and settings and organizations, meaning that it can be used with children and adults, small or large providers in rural or urban areas, and with organizations with various levels of resources. So one of the key strengths of this model is that it builds upon previous frameworks to address the identified implementation challenges. Some of these challenges include lack of flexibility, lack of metrics to show value of integration, and lack of financing to support implementation and sustainability of these models. When speaking about flexibility, the CHI model focuses on bidirectional integration, so it can be used to integrate for behavioral health services to be integrated into a physical health setting, or for physical health services to be integrated into a behavioral health setting, and vice versa. It can be used with diverse populations and provides options for organizations to improve their level of integration based on their resources and capacity. When speaking about metrics, it provides core elements and measures to standardize the quality of care, measure performance and outcomes, and improve accountability. It also highlights payment methodologies that can be used at each stage of integration to ensure payment and reimbursement of services. Some of the limitations of this model, because there's always limitations, is that it's a new framework. So since it's new, that means there's limited use. They did receive feedback on the feasibility and utility after its initial publication in 2022, and with that, they republished in 2025 based on the feedback that they received. And the publishers are encouraging organizations to run pilots and provide feedback to continue improving the framework. Since it's a new framework, there's also no data on long-term outcomes and how effective it might be. However, the measures in the framework seek to address that by providing a way to produce this outcome data and measure impact. An additional limitation is that it requires significant initial investment on the organization's part based on time and resources to get started and improve their integration of services. So this means organizations might not see the benefit for a long term. So what does this mean for social workers? Well, given our presence across systems, we are uniquely positioned to help organizations advance integrated healthcare solutions to improve outcomes for underserved populations. At the micro level, this looks like direct practice social workers providing patient care in integrated settings and collaborating with interdisciplinary teams. This provides a critical opportunity for us to screen, assess, and engage people at various entry points, whether it be in hospitals and emergency departments, primary or behavioral health settings, inpatient or substance use, or within the criminal justice system. At the meso or macro level, our education and training in policy practice, program design, implementation, and evaluation prepares us to help at the systems level to shape programs and policy. To conclude, the CHI framework offers a useful tool to turn core social work values into action by promoting holistic, evidence-based care, understanding individuals within the context of their environment, and advancing health equity for underserved populations. Thank you. And next, I will introduce my friend and colleague, the one and only Moses Gong.
Hey everybody. The last time I gave this presentation, it was 16 minutes long. Dr. Hussey encouraged us to be brief. Let's see how I do today. Cool. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. My name is Moses Gong. I am going to be talking a little bit about citizens' assemblies today. So outside of my studies at the Mandel School, I do some political and community organizing work. It's kind of a fraught space to be in right now. I personally have felt a little bit frustrated with the state of our democracy. And I think that I was wondering, how can we engage with it outside of our elections? It's clear that if 85% of people in Western democracies on average, including 85% of people in the United States, say that our democracy needs major reform, in order for them to feel satisfied with it, we need new tools to engage with it. So what I came across is something called a citizens assembly. Citizens assembly are one iteration of something called a democratic mini-public. So citizens assemblies are actually something that are really cool. They take a process called sortition, which is where you would take a slice of society that's representative of whatever level of society that the assembly would be representing. So let's say if we're looking at the city of Cleveland, you would take a sample of the population of the city of Cleveland, get a group of about 100 citizens together to deliberate on an issue that's relevant to the society. So right now, the only precedent that we have for the government asking us to show up is elections, which are optional, but really it's jury duty, because we're not required to vote. But what if instead of just being called on to decide whether or not someone committed a crime, we were called on to deliberate how to offer childcare for everyone in Cleveland, how we should be spending the city's budget? And so a citizens assembly would be that, taking a slice of Cleveland's population and then asking them to deliberate and come up with recommendations on a civic issue. It sounds like a kind of radical, hipster, whatever innovation, but really it's a democratic practice that goes back to ancient Athens, where citizens were randomly called upon to deliberate military strategy, to decide on urban planning issues, and I think that there's space for us to bring it back to 2025. And so when we think about the democratic conditions that we would be trying to implement a citizens assembly in, right now, we live in a media ecosystem where everyone is getting different versions of reality. My fact stream might be different than your fact stream, unfortunately. As I mentioned earlier, 85% of Americans and typically around 80% of people in Western democracies say that democracy requires major reform in order to be truly representative. And we're not ever called upon to really interact with people that are different than ourselves. In a citizens assembly, one of the major selling points for me was that people from different political parties, religions, socioeconomic classes, education groups would all be required to participate in the assembly. With that being said, there are a lot of different ways of having a citizens assembly. You can think about having one at a municipal level, so that'd be the city of Cleveland. At a regional level, that may be the county or the state, or at the national level. France has actually called citizens assemblies for people to debate climate change at a national level, which is really impressive. There's also a few other variables. How long are people meeting? How many people are part of the assembly? Who's funding it and sponsoring it? All those things require consideration when thinking about a citizens assembly. But the theory of change really boils down to representation, a representative slice of democracy that is accompanied by resources and support. Citizens assemblies are often given access to experts who can help inform dialogue on whatever the issue is, plus political advocacy tools, and I'll get into this a little bit later, can have some really amazing impacts. To me, one of the biggest impacts, especially in the short term, is community building. Just sitting in a room, having a dialogue with someone from a different background than you, which we don't really have the opportunity now. In the longer term, rebuilding trust in democracy, equipping everyday citizens with the ability to deliberate and engage with issues that we typically relegate to elected officials and experts. All of these are, in my opinion, transformative indicators for success and a new approach to democracy that our country could really benefit from. I say our country because, unfortunately, specifically because we're really lacking in citizens assemblies here. There's only been about 5 examples of citizens assemblies happening in the United States in the last 30 years, when there are dozens and hundreds of examples of them happening in Europe. For my research, I looked at a few case studies, but I brought up 2 today. One happened in Colorado and one happened in Ireland. Ireland has a really cool precedent for citizens assemblies. Actually, going back to the early 2010s, Ireland has been using citizens assemblies to debate everything: how to handle drug policy. A citizens assembly actually was responsible for a ballot initiative that legalized abortion and same-sex marriage in Ireland. The assembly that I looked at for my case study here was actually a citizens assembly on gender equality. So the Irish Parliament called for a citizens assembly on the issue. The assembly came up with a long list of recommendations, more than 40 recommendations. And what happened was that the Irish parliamentarians then took those recommendations, put them in their own language, and unfortunately watered a lot of them down before putting them on the ballot. The ballot initiative that would have approved the gender equality recommendations of the assembly ultimately failed, but the process was really rich and revealing and kind of made a case for citizens assemblies being able to wield more direct power. Why should an assembly that is representative of democracy be forced to dilute its power by handing it to legislators? So that was one example of a citizens assembly, and I should have said that all of that Irish citizens assemblies is entirely sponsored by the government. Another example of a citizens' assembly took place in Montrose, Colorado, where a nonprofit with a lot of money that I actually spoke to hosted a citizens' assembly to debate how childcare could be affordably provided to everyone in the community in Colorado. It was a slightly smaller assembly, about 45 to 60 people debating over 12 weeks, mostly virtually, but they ended up having a slightly different process because it was sponsored by a nonprofit. They just got a commitment from local officials to follow up on the recommendations of the assembly. And actually, as a result of the assembly, they formed a nonprofit whose exclusive job was to lobby for the recommendations of the assembly to be pursued at the conclusion of the assembly. And so I found a couple of other general findings in the research. One is that, like I said, we need more of them in the United States, much more of them. Another is that when we have them in the United States, people really love them. The people that participated in citizens' assemblies, the vast majority said it's a process that they would do again and they would recommend to other people. They also stated at more than 80% rates that they were in agreement with people that they thought they would disagree with as a result of participating in the assembly. So there's a ton of fertile ground for collaboration we've just never been invited to, which to me was very hopeful. Another distinguishing fact that I noticed in the difference between European and American assemblies is that in America, the assemblies that we do have are often sponsored or co-sponsored by nonprofits, whereas in Europe, as I mentioned, France sponsoring a national citizens' assembly about climate change, they're almost always government endeavors. And so thinking about all that, I kind of had 3 recommendations, and I have a lot more points that I'd love to talk with you about at the poster. One of the recommendations that I have is that governments should always be sponsoring citizens' assemblies. Like I mentioned, that's how it works in Europe. To me, the advantage of a government sponsoring it is that there's more attention and accountability for the assembly. If taxpayers know their money is being spent on a government initiative, even if everyone isn't a part of the assembly, it immediately puts more eyes on it, and it creates a culture of accountability for it, which I think is important. And of course, more likely to be followed up on than if a nonprofit does it. Another recommendation that I arrived at after the research is that it's really important that we do more research about what allows people to participate or not participate. Like I mentioned, citizens' assemblies have to be representative societies. But if we have different education groups, or different like parental statuses, so it's not clear based on the research if parents are less likely to participate in assemblies because childcare isn't provided, or if poor families have a harder time participating because they're not paid enough for their participation. So we really need to do more work to understand what is going into assemblies working or not working for people to participate. And then the third recommendation is that we should train everyone that participates in citizens' assemblies as community organizers and political advocates in order to ensure that their recommendations are followed up on. In Ireland, in the case study that I mentioned, the people that participate in the assembly kind of felt powerless after the parliament took their recommendations, watered them down, and then offered a version of their recommendations to the public that they felt wasn't representative of their views. But researchers that have studied citizens' assemblies have suggested that if we train people that participate as organizers and political advocates, if they know who to call and how to put out a media statement and how to really hold government stakeholders accountable, it makes it more likely for the recommendations to be followed up on. Thank you so much for learning a little bit about citizens' assemblies with me. I'm excited to talk with you all more about them at my poster. I appreciate y'all. And I'm super excited to introduce my friend Tommy Odo up to the podium.
All right. Hi, folks. My name is Tommy. Moses, thank you for the introduction. Keeping in the spirit of everyday democracy, my project focuses on how we can invite more participation into our philanthropy practices. So traditionally, at the large private foundation level, at the community foundation level, donors, staff, board members are really the key decision makers when it comes to setting the strategy, the priorities, and ultimately deciding who gets funded. It's also true that, I'll lower this actually a little bit. It's also true that over time, we've seen an erosion of trust in our nonprofit sector, especially in philanthropy, right? Like trusting that foundations are going to make the right decision with funding and what they're trying to invest in as well. And then also, it's true that donors, staff, board members, they don't often look like and call home. They don't often look like many of the people that they're trying to serve, right? The communities that they're looking to invest in. So keeping all of that in mind, many foundations are looking for ways to promote trust and promote representation in grant-making practices. So this is where participatory grant-making comes in, or PGM. It's new in the discourse, but really community-driven giving practices have been around for hundreds of years, back to indigenous gift economies, mutual aid networks. There's a long history of communities coming together to fund different solutions. What I'm interested in now is kind of bringing those practices into the institutional level, right? Incorporating everyday community members into those decisions. So some of my key questions that guided this: who has decision-making power, and how are those decisions made? How does PGM kind of improve trust, representation, and alignment with community priorities to kind of bridge that gap that I've described between traditional foundations and a different way of doing philanthropy? And then finally, what barriers to implementing PGM exists, right? At a capacity and staff level, the amount of time that it takes, what's keeping people from, and foundations really, from adopting these practices and making it the norm. My methods were twofold. I did a literature review. In the gray literature, there's lots of case studies at a national, global level of people that have piloted PGM over the last decade or so. So lots of interesting case studies there. I also did a little bit of benchmarking. Locally here in Cleveland, the St. Luke's Foundation has piloted a participatory approach called the Resident Advancement Committee. I was fortunate to have a conversation with their program officer, Indigo. And so to kind of highlight some of those case studies, the two that I really wanted to hone in on was the Brooklyn organization. So it's a community foundation. Since 2014, it's been piloting participatory grant-making approaches. So one of the key programs, one is an identity-based program, and then one is a place-based program in a certain neighborhood in Brooklyn. I was really struck by, they have a youth-led program. So young people in Brooklyn have the opportunity to set the agenda around the criteria, the strategy, and really make decisions around projects that excited them, around social justice, really whatever was energizing to them in their neighborhood. So I found that to be a really interesting example, and I think Brooklyn Org has actually transitioned to become fully to do participatory grant making on a full-time basis. So they spend about $4 million annually using these practices in all of their programs. A really interesting case study I came across too is called the Red Umbrella Fund. This is a global fund. It's the first of its kind. It's led by sex workers, and its whole mission is to fund sex worker-led organizations and advance the rights of that community. Since 2012, it's been operating. It has two main committees. One is a peer review committee, so kind of initial screening, reviewing proposals, and then another committee that sets the strategy, priorities, and ultimately decides what grassroots sex worker-led organizations are going to get funded. There's a requisite 80% representation on those committees, and they decide by consensus as well. So really interesting approach that elevates a community that's often very distant from philanthropy. I mentioned at the local level there's the Resident Advancement Committee. I would love to talk more about those examples at the poster, but some key learnings from all of this, really participatory grant making in testimony and kind of reporting out from these groups and others improves understanding between donors, staff, board members, and community members. Also, I've seen this firsthand as a staff member at Neighborhood Connections, where we do a resident-led small grants program, elevating local leadership and connections. Community members that live across the city making a connection at an interview for a proposal that they're reviewing that they wouldn't have made beforehand. So kind of elevating that leadership as well. And then, as I mentioned, shifting power to groups that are often distant from philanthropy. Sex workers, youth, it's an opportunity to invite in people that aren't really involved in these processes. And some challenges to keep in mind. It takes a lot of sacrifice. I've learned it takes a lot of sacrifice on a foundation's part and on community members' part to make this work. If you're new to grant making, there's a learning curve, right? What is the organization's history? What have their priorities been in the past? St. Luke's Foundation has definitely experienced several iterations of that, and I know Neighborhood Connections has as well. So really allowing for enough time to build relationships. And then finally, Moses touched on this as well, representation. Who's invited and who's allowed to be in these practices. I want to read this quote from Cecilia Clark, who is a staff member at Brooklyn Organization. I worry about authenticity in these efforts and whether we're really hearing the voice of people, especially those who don't have a voice. I think Red Umbrella Fund and others are finding unique ways to include folks that aren't usually at the tables. So what they've done is, after seeing that in Europe and North America, most of the committee members came from those areas, to include sex workers from the Global South, translated a lot of their application materials, added the capacity of interpreters to make the process more accessible. Finally, social workers, we sit at the intersection of fundraising, service delivery. I think we're really equipped to ask our foundations, from a community foundation to a larger private foundation, what are you doing to invite community members into your processes? Clearly, it's not enough to kind of keep doing philanthropy as old. I think there's a real interest that I've seen in foundations in making that shift happen as well. And then in Cleveland and some of these smaller grant programs, is there an opportunity to scale up and shift more dollars into funds that are community controlled? Would love to talk more about it, but thank you all so much. I would like to introduce my friend, colleague, Ali Pale.
All right. Oop, that went too far. There we go. We're going to switch gears a little bit. So moving a little bit away from democracy, I'm going to talk a little bit about using the neurosequential model of therapeutics, or NMT, with unaccompanied refugee minors, or URMs. So I came across this project because I worked with unaccompanied refugee minors in Michigan, and as I was going through my phase 1 certification for NMT, I was like, gosh, this would have been useful to know. And so I became curious about if anyone else had kind of looked into how this approach can be used with this specific population. So a little bit of background on URMs and the program in general. It's a federally run program contracted to state organizations and local organizations to service unaccompanied refugee minors throughout the United States. So despite what the name suggests, not all youth in the program have to have refugee status, but they have to have some sort of eligible immigrant status. And they receive services in a long-term foster care program until the age of 21. So from fiscal year 2014 to 2018, that was the most recent data I can find. As we know, some is magically disappearing online due to our current administration. So fiscal year 18 is what I have data through. There were 1,950 entrants into the URM program. They're an extremely diverse group representing over 50 countries of origin, 100 ethnicities, and 80 languages. But despite the diversity in this group, there's an overarching need for mental health services. Different things such as anxiety, depression, PTSD are really common mental health concerns among URMs. However, research suggests that URMs are less likely than their non-immigrant peers to access mental health services despite having a higher unmet need. So some of what I did for this project was literature review, classic, and then did some semi-structured interviews with experts in the field, including a practitioner in Texas who uses the NMT framework with immigrant populations, as well as a colleague from Michigan who has spent 10 plus years working in the URM program field, both at the local and now the federal level. And they provided some really great insight for me. So my suggested intervention is using the NMT framework as an approach for assessing the mental health needs of URMs. NMT is a very holistic framework that I could give an entire 7-minute presentation on alone, that guides therapeutic treatment based on neuroscience ideas. So the NMT assessment, also called a metric, examines adverse and relational history, current functioning of the youth, and developmental assaults, and results in what you can see under the intervention section at the top, a lovely brain map. So the one on the right that has mostly green would be an age-typical brain map, whereas the one on the left is an example client, where you can begin to see some deficits in certain functioning areas in the red and pink colors, the yellow representing more of medium functional deficits, and then the green representing like the ideal function. So using a map like this can help youth themselves, caregivers, teachers, other people in their lives kind of understand how their behaviors are representative of unmet needs and lowered brain development. So the whole idea kind of behind NMT is that trauma affects the brain. So when kids experience trauma at a highly important developmental age, it's going to affect how their brain develops. And it suggests that clinicians use approaches that are appropriate for the child's level of brain development and function. So the other two graphics that the NMT metric spits out at the bottom, on the right, you'll see like a developmental risk graphic. So ideally, we want kids to be in green. However, as you can see, this client is red and dipping down into yellow. And then on the left, you can see the red line is a history of adverse experiences, whereas the green line is relational health. So ideally, you'd want to see those flipped with the green on the top and the red on the bottom. But most of the kids you're working with in a program like this are going to have the red on the top with the green on the bottom. So you'll see another graphic kind of at the bottom, and this is where we get into the lizard brain part. So if you look at how a brain is represented, both in those metrics at the top and in that kind of theory of change graphic at the bottom, it's an upside-down triangle. So you start at the bottom of your brain, which is the brainstem, diencephalon, limbic system, and then your cortex. And so the whole idea is that your brainstem is kind of your lizard brain, your survival, fight, flight, or freeze. It's why I'm probably talking fast and my heart is racing, because I'm thinking y'all are gonna heckle me or throw tomatoes at me, right? But I'm doing deep breaths to try and regulate myself. So the whole idea is that, you can't do CBT with a kid who doesn't feel safe, who's stuck in their lizard brain. And despite liking those interventions that we use, they're not always going to be effective for populations like this, because we have to emphasize safety first. So we start with the lizard brain. And brains, no matter where you're from, what country you're from, your brain is going to develop from the inside out and the bottom up. So that's what makes NMT such a desirable approach for this extremely diverse population, is because all human brains develop in the same way, and trauma is going to affect the human brain in predictable ways. So some findings: current mental health assessments for URMs are not always culturally translatable or adaptable, which leads to either inaccurate assessments, not the correct services, or kids not fully understanding and their caregivers not fully understanding the best ways to help them kind of improve the quote-unquote bad behaviors they want to see improve, or the outcomes they would like to see. There are also varying cultural views about therapy, issues of access, and then timing. So if you assess a kid right when they move from their country of origin to the United States versus 5 months out from there, you're going to get wildly different assessment results, because that kid is going to have adapted to their environment. So it kind of highlights the need for continuing assessment, which we know as social workers is very important. And so, like I said, all human brains and nervous systems develop the same, and safety is essential for everyone, which is what makes NMT a really cool approach to use with this potential population. And right now, many successes in mental health for URMs depend on their caseworker or their individual clinician and how they approach mental health. So if a caseworker is really pro-mental health, trying to get them involved in services, versus someone who maybe doesn't ask every time they see the kid if they would like to engage in therapy or explain what it is, that's gonna really determine the kid's access to mental health services. So there is a lack of research in this area. NMT itself is fairly new, and so exploring NMT with specific populations outside of kids who generally experience abuse and neglect is still coming up, but it's a really cool area that I hope gets some research soon. And then the other part is the NMT metric can be very timely to complete, especially if you're in an organization that doesn't have NMT built into its framework. But despite that, we as social workers can advocate for that framework to be adopted in organizations and advocate for us to have time to do these types of holistic assessments. So thank you. And I'm excited to introduce Kiera Rowland.
Okay. All right, so I explored the integration of artificial intelligence in social work, partly because I just find like technology and social services and the intersection kind of scary, but also really exciting, and I wanted to kind of learn more about it. So to start with the basic definition of artificial intelligence, it is a wide umbrella term, and it often refers to many different algorithmic computing systems that perform human-like functions. So this can range from speech recognition to facial recognition, whole language processing, and more. And then a relatively new subset of artificial intelligence is generative AI, which refers to tools that generate new images, video, audio, and text from existing data. And this is where you get tools like ChatGPT. But AI itself is not a new concept, even in social work. As early as the late 1990s, there was discussion of using artificial neural networks and other predictive models to predict which clients are at greater risk of psychiatric hospitalization. So these conversations have been around for a while. And currently in the field of social work, we're facing many challenges like high caseload, staff burnout, limited resources, and some have proposed that AI could be a solution to some of these challenges. With this in mind, I conducted a literature review guided by 3 main questions. First, how is AI currently being used in social work? What are the benefits and challenges to using artificial intelligence? And then what does the research say about its effectiveness? So for applications, these are some of the main ones that I found, but I'm sure there's more, and how fast technology moves, there might be a new one by the time I finish this presentation. But first we have mental health support. So this can range from using like an on-demand virtual counselor to people just simply using generative AI as a therapist. Harvard Business Review published an article just 2 weeks ago and reported that the top use of Gen AI in 2025 has been therapy and companionship, which I think is a huge signal to social workers that this is a topic you should care about. Other interesting uses include predictive analytics. So DataKind is an organization that combines data science and AI for social impact. And they've worked with food pantries to predict a client's level of dependency and to help prioritize resources. AI tools are also being used in case management, child welfare decision-making, education and research. And so there's lots of really innovative, exciting uses for AI. However, there are some challenges. First, the environmental impact. Although we're still really trying to understand the full effects of AI on energy use and emissions, research indicates that training a single model like ChatGPT uses the same amount of electricity as 120 American households a year. So we do know that these are using massive amounts of resources, and what that is going to mean long term, we're still figuring out. And then the issues with data bias and other algorithmic justice issues. Even though data itself may seem neutral, we know that's not true. Some groups are over or underrepresented in data, and that affects how the algorithms are producing whatever they're telling you. And then the limited research and standardization. Because social work AI research is relatively new, there's a lack of evidence-informed recommendations for best practices, and this can heighten ethical risks. So after reviewing the current applications and challenges, my biggest takeaways were first, some research does suggest that these tools can be effective, like the on-demand virtual counselors. Early research showed that they were helpful and people did enjoy using them. However, we don't really have comprehensive research on the long-term impacts. What does it mean in 20 years if people are using ChatGPT as their therapist? And the significant ethical and practical concerns also stand out to me. As I kind of touched on already, algorithmic bias can really exacerbate some of the societal inequities that we already have. An example of that in hiring is if you've hired only males in the past, these algorithms can learn that males are the ideal candidate and then filter out resumes that might signal it's a woman. So these kind of algorithmic issues can really just show how inequitable so many of our systems are. And then the concern about whether AI can replace the human-to-human nature of social work, which is fundamental to our field. Empathy, critical thinking, ambiguity even are core elements of social work. So if anything, AI should complement our practice and not replace it. So then where do we go from here? The technology sector right now has a lot of unchecked power. Social workers are often left out of the conversation, and even more, the people we serve are often left out. Who's designing these tools? What data are they training these models on? What does that data imply about our society? And who's accountable when things go wrong? These are all questions that we really haven't answered. And it's crucial for social workers to meaningfully engage in the development and implementation of AI. AI is increasing in prevalence, and it may have significant long-term impacts on the people we're working with. And social workers have great skills in building relationships and building bridges between clients, AI developers, other professionals is vital. It's also vital to really try to bring in the voices of people from underrepresented communities, as they're often left out of these conversations. Additionally, we need to look at developing some kind of operational ethical framework for how social workers should use AI in our practice. And then one potential model is kind of shown with the circles over there, is the unified model of AI-enhanced social work, which was published last year. And this framework builds on the triple mandate concept, which focuses on social workers' three main areas of responsibility: to our clients, to our profession, and to our agencies. So for clients, it advocates for user-centered AI, human-centered AI, and it also respects clients' rights to participate both in their data being used in AI, but also participate in the development of AI. And then for the profession, this framework emphasizes the need for education and training on AI, especially around ethical and privacy concerns. And for agencies, it recognizes that change takes time, and it recommends that organizations set realistic expectations for AI adoption, understanding that clients and social workers may have hesitations. So to wrap up, AI brings really exciting possibilities for enhancing social work, but also presents significant challenges and potential unintended consequences. And a lot of the concerns people have, I think, are very real, and I share a lot of the fear that many people also feel. But I did like this quote, which is now not showing. This quote at the bottom that I'll leave you with, which says, "By far the greatest danger of artificial intelligence is that people conclude too early that they understand it." So, with that being said, thank you. And it's my pleasure to welcome the wonderful Ellie Rume.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. My name is Ellie, and for my Capstone project, I studied the role of school social workers in optimizing full-service community schools. So moving into the background of full-service community schools, it's rooted in two pieces of legislation, both of which aim to provide additional resources to under-resourced schools, as well as just encourage school staff to approach education and students experiencing chronic absenteeism with a preventative approach rather than a punitive approach. The theory of change behind this model is that if you equip schools with not only academic resources, but additional resources that address personal needs, such as mental health, physical health resources, that students and families will feel more equipped, comfortable, and able to show up to school. Matriculation rates will improve, graduation rates will improve, and ideally students will go on to pursue higher education and become active and successful members in society. My posts are probably printed the worst of here, so good luck with reading that. But I just wanted to point out that students of vulnerable populations are the most likely to experience chronic absenteeism. So moving on to the intervention, what is the full-service community school approach? So central to the approach are these 4 pillars listed in the intervention section. So the first being integrated student supports. Second is expanded and enriched learning time and opportunities. Third is active family and community engagement. And then lastly, collaborative leadership and practice. So these are really broad umbrella terms, and within those 4 pillars are those pipeline services also listed in the intervention section. So when school districts, community centers apply for this grant program, they have to specify how they're going to implement at least 3 of those pipeline services with the grant funding. So how is this all done? So central to the community school approach are positions called community school coordinators. These people, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Typically, they look to have bachelor's degree. They typically are already established in the community, but their qualifications I'll discuss a little bit later. They offer essentially case management to the students, the staff members, family members, community members that they're working with. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about their qualifications later. Regarding schools that have more traditional school social workers, as you can see in the intervention section, I included a quote from the School Social Work Association of America about what school social workers do. So they essentially act as a liaison between schools, family members, and the community. So talking about the methods that I used, primarily I wanted to focus on benchmarking interviews. So interviewing key stakeholders from the direct service, boots on the ground, from a community perspective and also a school perspective, all the way through a policy perspective. I don't know why it's not up there, but I also did a brief literature review, just navigating different databases that compile educational research. And then I looked at key case studies that are listed on those in that table underneath my methods section. So for the findings, I'll talk a little bit briefly about what I learned from each of my interviews with the stakeholders. So starting with Stephen at the U.S. Department of Education, he pointed out the technical assistance that he and his colleagues provide to grantees. He also mentioned that there are several times a year where grantees that are awarded funding can come together, share strengths, challenges, and he also spoke a lot about key states that are doing really good work. And some of those programs, school districts, community centers, are here in Ohio. When I talked to Emily at the Learning Policy Institute, she provided a more educational research perspective to this approach. And she's just hoping that grantees that are awarded funding focus on implementation. So how are they following the model with fidelity? How are they receiving feedback? How are they pivoting if something isn't working, rather than just focusing on how, like, the program evaluation outcomes? With Logan Hawking School District, something that Bryce said to me during our interview that was really impactful was, he said, we have a third grade reading guarantee, but we don't have a third grade seeing guarantee. So we focus a lot about making sure students get the academic support that they need, but what about the basic needs, resources that often go underserved? And he spoke about the physical health resources that the district is providing. So they implemented a school-based health clinic, and they also purchased a van to transport students and their families to medical appointments. Lastly, my conversation with Sean at the Hope Zone in Dayton, which is a community center. He spoke about 15 student success coordinators, which is their version of the community school coordinators. Their work spans 17 neighborhoods, interacts with several different schools. And then something else that he mentioned that really stuck out to me were the community working groups. So there are 4 community working groups: community engagement, economic stability, health and wellness, and then education. So these are community member led, and then community members are also incentivized to go to these, and then what they discuss in these meetings informs how grant funding is used. I want to point your attention to the case study under my findings section. So in a study with an African-American teacher at a full-service community school, she said that she aligned socially and politically with this model. So not only is it promising that this is serving our students and their families from a more holistic approach, it could also align more closely with our school staff. Lastly, I'll talk about this a little bit in the discussion and implications, but there's limited comprehensive research that exists. So the last grantee was awarded funding in 2023, so they're still in that grant cycle. So limited comprehensive data exists, but what I found in my literature review was that because there are so many pipeline services that grantees can choose from, there are a lot of outcomes that they're seeing that address the common barriers that exist to getting kids to school and keeping them in school. The literature review also emphasized the variability of the model. So in my case studies and my conversations, I was hearing from people from urban communities, rural communities, elementary through high school, and I can even argue college. So moving on to the discussion and implications, so strengths. I mentioned this briefly, but there is such a variability with this model. You can combine any of those pipeline services, and you can service schools in urban communities, rural communities. You can be school districts, or you can be community centers. So it's super applicable to a ton of different environments. Also, through my conversations and my brief literature review, I've learned that grantees have been super successful in engaging a wide variety of partners. So health partners, community and local colleges, hospitals, it really runs the gamut. So partners have been engaged, and it's been really successful for grantees. I also saw a lot of convergence. So what I was hearing from the policy level, what they were hoping to come from this program was actually happening. So there's a lot of convergence between my literature review and my conversations with the stakeholders. The challenges, so kind of talking about how new this is, there's limited comprehensive research that exists, so limited meta-analyses and systematic reviews that exist, synthesizing the outcomes of these approaches and these programs in schools and community centers. We have to talk about the elephant in the room. The uncertainty of the Department of Education is huge, and so therefore federal funding is kind of uncertain regarding this program. The issue of sustainability came up in all 4 of my conversations with stakeholders, so it's a real struggle here. Moving on to what does this mean for school social workers? So I can't talk too much about the qualifications of community school coordinators because their qualifications are a little bit more vague and they can look different depending on the community that they're in. But I can talk about licensed school social workers and what we can bring to the table. So as a school social work pathway study, we have 60+ hours of social work and education coursework. We have 900 hours of field education. We practice under the core competencies of social work, and we're governed by several local and nationwide organizations. Incorporating school social work into the full-service community school model ensures that practitioners are formally trained to implement and strengthen the Tier 2 and 3 supports in schools that are often lacking but are severely needed. Social workers, as my colleagues have mentioned, are really uniquely situated because we can operationalize and standardize the care being provided by practitioners and contribute to the whole child holistic approach to education being applied by and foundational to this approach. Social workers exist in so many different environments, all of which can be used to benefit our students and their family members. And I leave you with just the encouragement that we get more involved with schools. I would love to see school social workers being hired as community school coordinators or being involved in the hiring of and training of these professionals. Thank you. My mouth is really dry, but I'm going to try and get this last paragraph out. Okay, so as everyone has mentioned, thank you guys so much for coming. On behalf of the 12th cohort of Mandel Leadership Fellows, we would like to thank our fellow students, faculty and staff, mentors, and the Mandel Foundation for their support and generosity over the past 2 years. We appreciate all that you have done for us. Additionally, we want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Hussey for his unwavering support in and out of the classroom. This concludes the live stream session of the program. Thank you so much for joining us. We will now transition to the poster session and look forward to discussing our capstones with you and answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.